There's a lot I could say about our next speaker. In fact, I spent 2 years in a classroom with him, and what a joy that was, being and studying alongside Andrew Beasley. He's a minister at the Langs congregation in Langs, Ohio. He's a student, in fact, he's a senior student at Faulkner University. He's going for his biblical studies degree there. Graduate, the 2017. And when you have fellow students in your class throughout the school, you develop a bond with each other, a special bond that is that we stand for the truth together. And Andrew is a dear friend of mine and a dear brother in Christ, and he is going to speak to us today on Psalm 142.
I got a little nervous there because I wasn't sure if Steve was going to use the word joy in describing my 2 years spent with him in the classroom. I thought he might choose something a little less friendly, but I appreciate that, Steve. I appreciate the congregation here at Hillview so much, having spent a good amount of time here, and I appreciate the faculty and especially the lectureship committee for giving me another opportunity to speak on the lectureship here at the West Virginia School of Preaching. When you sit in those classrooms and you get to come to the lectures when you're a student here, at least for me, one of my goals was to be able at some point in my lifetime to stand before you all and discuss a text on the lectureship from the Bible. So to be able to do this a second time, you're probably wondering what kind of dirt I have on the lectureship committee, and I'm going to plead the fifth on that. Andy's up there somewhere rubbing his head, and that's why he doesn't have much hair left. I'll take some of the blame for that. I want to start out with a question, though, based off of something that I've seen on the black hole that is Facebook from time to time. There's a post that comes up that says, if being hurt by people in the church causes you to leave and stop going to church, then your faith was in people and not in God. And I want to ask if you believe that to be true. And ask yourself if you believe that that is an attitude that Christians today should embody as we go out and engage with the world. If being hurt by someone in the church causes you to stop coming to church, your faith was in people and not God. I heard a story one time from a preacher, an older preacher, but he was recounting a story from when he was a youth minister. And when he was a youth minister, bus ministries were a big thing. I remember bus ministries from when I was a kid. They used to be a really effective way to bring young people into our worship services. We don't necessarily use that tool too much. Some congregations still do, but it's not as widespread as it once was. But he told this story about a young boy who they would pick up on this route, and he would come to Sunday morning worship with them. And boy, he just loved it. He loved being able to come to Sunday morning Bible class. He loved getting to sit and worship and just be a part of it, but his mom didn't come with him. And he begged her for weeks upon weeks, will you just come? Will you just come to worship one time? And finally, she finally gave in and she said, you know what? I'll go with you. And as you would imagine, this young man, this little boy, 8 or 9 years old, was just thrilled. The bus stopped at his house. He and his mom got on the bus. They made their way to the church building, and there was just a pep in that young man's step as he got to go in to the church building with his mom and introduce her to everyone. He was so excited. And it went well. He went to Bible class. She got to go. And everything went well. Worship went well. She seemed to enjoy herself. And the youth minister, this older preacher at the time when I heard the story, talked about how after worship they were standing out in the foyer. And he was having a conversation with someone else, and she was just a few feet away from him. And an older lady walks up to this young man's mother, and she steps up to speak to her, and she says, "You know, it was great to have you with us this morning, but if you come again, do you think you could wear something more appropriate?" Do you think that woman ever came back? You know how the story is going to end, don't you? The next Sunday, the bus stopped out in front of that young man's house. His mom didn't come out, and neither did he. And they never saw him again. Turn your attention briefly to the words of the Apostle Paul as he begins his letter to the church in Corinth. His second, we call it 2 Corinthians, really his fourth letter to the church in Corinth. And after he gives his greeting in verse 3, he describes who God is. He says that God is the Father of mercies. He's the God of all comfort. But Paul doesn't just stop there. He says that God comforts us in our tribulations, in our afflictions, and that he comforts us in our afflictions that we might then go out and comfort others as they endure their trials and tribulations, that they might know the comfort of God as well, that they might be comforted with the same comfort that God comforted us with. And I want you to keep those thoughts in mind as we turn our attention to our text of the morning, Psalm 142. The 142nd Psalm is a psalm that's attributed to David, and it's described as having to do with a time in which David was in the cave, is what the passage, what the title is attributed to. And it goes further to place the psalm in the category of being a maskil. Now, Matthew Henry tells us that a maskil means that it is written with the intention of instruction. Vine gives us a little bit more vivid of a definition of the word. He says that it means to be prudent, or to be wise, or to make wise, to teach, or to instruct. And he says that this word can be found in the title of Psalms of Instruction. And so as we get ready to engage with our text this morning, we understand that this psalm is not just one where David, the author, is expressing his innermost emotions. It's not just a pouring out of how David feels, but it is also providing us with a model for how we might relate to God in times of trial, in times of stress, in times of grief, or in times of just general unrest in our lives. Now, as we get ready to think about this psalm, we recognize that there are two times in the Bible that are described, that the Bible gives us as when David was in a cave. The first comes in 1 Samuel 22, where David leaves Gath and he escapes to the cave of Adullam. The second one occurs just a couple chapters later in chapter 24, and there we're told that Saul is told that David is at En-Gedi. And we know that a confrontation happens there between the two. And so we ask, which of these caves is the backdrop for this psalm? And the answer really is, we don't know. More importantly, it's that it doesn't really matter which cave it was. It's inconsequential. Whether it's Adullam, whether it's En-Gedi, it's the case that Saul is pursuing David for the purpose of cutting off a perceived threat to the throne of Israel and the royal line of Israel. Now, we might make an interesting connection here between David and Elijah, the prophet. Because we recognize that David, who sought to do the will of God, will find himself in a cave, alone, isolated. And we know that Elijah finds himself in a cave, alone and isolated. And both really find themselves there because of corrupt kings who sought their own personal glory above the glorification of God. And when we think about it, not that much has changed from their time to our time today. Good, innocent, godly people still find themselves at risk. They still find themselves under threat of abuse from sources of power and authority, corrupt sources of power and authority. And so for this reason, among many, this Psalm of David, these words of instruction from David, are relevant to us today. And so as we begin to enumerate our blessings, as we count our blessings, we can be thankful for this psalm, for this maskil of David that instructs us on who to turn to for refuge when faced with the storms of life. A number of commentators break this psalm down in a variety of ways. For our purposes this morning, we're going to break it down into 3 parts. In verses 1 and 2, we're going to consider David's reaction to the situation that he's faced with. In verses 3 and 4, we'll consider David's reality. And in verses 5 through 7, we will look at David's reassurance. And even though he's not here, Terry Jones is smiling somewhere. As we begin with verse 1, we should note that because this is a psalm of instruction, it's likely not penned at the moment that David was in the cave. This is probably David looking back somewhere later in life and reflecting upon his ordeal at either Adullam or En Gedi. And yet even so, Spurgeon notes that the gloom of the cave is over the psalm, and he says, "And yet as if standing at the mouth of it, the prophet-poet sees a bright light a little beyond." It's not unusual for the faithful follower of God to take a moment and reflect on times of difficulty in their life and remember the emotions that they experienced in the heat of those great trials and tribulation, and remember what God did for them. In David's case, he looks back on those challenging times that brought about this plea for help, and he knew with certainty that his faith was well placed. And so he begins in verse 1 and 2. He says, "I cry out to the Lord with my voice. With my voice to the Lord I make my supplication. I pour out my complaint before him. I declare before him my trouble." Let's make note first at the method through which David prays. Notice the usage of the phrase, "with my voice," through the first 2 lines of the psalm. That sort of repetition, especially in ancient poetic writings, is a means of emphasizing something important to the writer. And so when David tells us twice that he used his voice, it's something that's important. It's something that should stand out to us. It's something that we should take note of. We should say, "Okay, David, what are you trying to tell us here?" Again, remember, he's instructing us. Now, we're going to see 2 different types of parallelism, something that's common in Hebrew poetry, occur in these first 2 verses. The first is what we call synonymous parallelism. It's seen in the first line, and it's repeated in the second line with a different ordering of the words, where he says, "I cry out to the Lord with my voice," flips it around a little bit. With my voice to the Lord, I make my supplication. Twice here, David is declaring the mechanism that he used to reach out to the Lord, seeking his aid. He spoke to God using his voice. That is not a demand on every individual that we beseech God with our voice. Prayer doesn't always have to be via the mechanism of spoken word. But for David, as he reflects upon this moment in the cave, he wants his reader to know that his plea is made with his voice. We should also note that this isn't just your everyday run-of-the-mill conversation. David cries out to the Lord. He shouts to the Lord. The second verse says that he poured out his complaint before him. He declared before him his trouble. And in this we find the second mechanism of parallelism employed by the author. We call it synthetic parallelism, where the second verse carries further or gives us greater understanding or greater depth of meaning to what's expressed in verse 1. And so what we find here, emphasized through the mechanisms of Hebrew poetry, is a relatable response. It's something we can understand. It's something we've been through. It's a relatable response to someone who has been pushed to their limits. Someone whose patience is exhausted and their desperation's all that remains. This is a man who can no longer hold things in. He can't hold things back. It sort of reminds me of Jeremiah in a way, when Jeremiah says that God's word was shut up inside of him like a fire in his bones, and he could not keep it in any longer. That's the way that David prays to God. He stands before God like a cup filled to its brim and beyond, and he pours out those problems to the Lord. Boy, I wish we could pray with such boldness today. I wish we did pray with such boldness today. Too often we find ourselves concerned with propriety. Too often we find ourselves concerned with reverence, and we allow those things to interfere with how we speak to God and with how we bring our problems before Him. If nothing else, from the first two verses of David reflecting on how he reacts to everything that's happening to him, we should feel encouraged. We should feel emboldened to bring our problems before God and not fear that doing so, or the way that we do so, might be somehow sinful. You can see that kind of boldness and that it's biblical. Look at Habakkuk chapter 1 and verse 2. When Habakkuk, the prophet, looks at God and he says, "How long do I have to cry out to you before you're finally going to pay attention and help?" In verse 3, he goes on to say, "How long are you going to let these wrongs continue to go on unanswered?" He's not afraid of asking God questions. He's not afraid of carrying his concerns to God. He prays boldly. David prays boldly here. The Christian is encouraged by the Hebrew writer to come boldly before the throne of grace, that grace might be found in times of need. We can find Paul writing to the church in Philippi, exhorting his readers in every situation, make their needs known to God. He doesn't say, be careful about the tone of voice that you use. Make sure your words are articulated properly. He just says, bring your cares and your burdens to God. Oh, that we would pray with the boldness of David. Oh, that we would pray with the fearlessness of David. Spurgeon notes the contrast between lines 1 and 2 of verse 1 and lines 1 and 2 of verse 2. He says that David pours out his natural longings when he says, "I cried." And then he gathers up his wits after crying out, after pouring out his emotions. He puts things together. And then he makes supplication. He arranges his thoughts and makes supplication. What a blessing. What an introduction to what the refuge of God looks like. As David reflects on his own life, showing his audience how to come before God with boldness and being unafraid. When alone in that cave, the place that David turns to is to God above, and he talks to him openly and freely without holding back. And for this, David should be praised. Mankind has a problem with relying on ourselves and worrying too much about what others might think. We have a problem of trusting in our own wisdom when faced with the great difficulties of life. And there's going to be times in David's life when he does the same thing. When he does just that, he trusts in his own wisdom. And yet here in this cave, left to his own thoughts, and with the uncertainty of what the future held for him on the horizon, he turns to God for peace. He turns to God for comfort, for solace, for refuge. And that's how he reacts to his situation. As he moves on to verses 3 and 4, after describing how he responded, how he reacted to his situation, he tells us what his reality looked like. He says, "When my spirit was overwhelmed within me, then you knew my path and the way in which I walk. They have secretly set a snare for me. Look on my right hand and see, for there is no one who acknowledges me. Refuge has failed me. No one cares for my soul." Remember again that the superscription of this psalm tells us that it's a reflection on what happened when David was in the cave. What that cave was like, what its living conditions must have been like, I don't know. We don't know what sort of comforts it may or may not have had. But I imagine it lacked the niceties that David was used to. He's one who served the king. He's one that we're told would even play music to soothe Saul's troubled spirit. And yet as David builds upon his initial reaction, it's not the physical world or his physical state that he laments. It's his emotional, it's his psychological state. And consider who David was, to be someone who gets to the point of saying, no one acknowledges me. Refuge has failed me. No one cares about me. I'm alone. This is a conquering hero. This is a man whose prowess in battle led people to write songs and sing songs about him, as in 1 Samuel 18, verse 7, where they celebrated that David had killed his tens of thousands. This is a mighty warrior, a man with a fierce spirit. It's a man who stared down the giant Goliath, and with just a sling and a few pebbles, and of course God on his side, took down that giant. His fervor, his courage, his bravery are something that is surely unquestioned, but he says that his spirit was overwhelmed. He is pushed to the brink. Now find comfort in those words. If a man such as David, a man of valor, a man of courage, could find himself in such a state of great trouble, then there should be no guilt. There should be no shame on the part of the Christian for having moments when our spirits are overwhelmed with us as well. We see here that these intense emotions weigh like anchors on the soul of David, and yet he offers us a glimpse of hope. In the midst of describing his misery, he offers us the first glimpse of hope, the first glimpse of peace, of comfort, of that refuge. Because even when he felt lost, even when he felt afraid, even when he felt overwhelmed, even when he didn't know where his own path was leading, when all those inner troubles assailed him, he had certainty that even if he didn't know, God did. And it's a simple statement that stands in contrast to the rest of his assertions in this central section of the psalm. Now, perhaps this is the case where the psalmist was reflecting on a time of uncertainty in his life and recognizing that even when he wasn't certain, God was. But as he laments the reality that he faces, the cherry on top of all of this is that he has no friends. No friends to lean upon. No one who cares for his soul. Everyone has seemingly abandoned him. And his loneliness comes out in this expression that nobody cares about me. Nobody cares about my soul. What a shame. What an absolute shame that this poor man had been left to the wolves. Surely a man who had found himself in the court of a king, who would play music for this king, surely he would have a litany of friends, a litany of acquaintances that he could rely upon, that he could call upon for help. And yet when he needed them the most, they were nowhere to be found. And who were these people? Who were they supposed to be? They're supposed to be God's people. This is God's chosen nation, God's chosen people of the Old Testament, and they are nowhere to be found when David needs them. Our minds might be drawn to a descendant of David. When he found himself in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he asked for his 3 friends to stay awake and keep watch as he prayed to God, and his sweat plummets to the ground like drops of blood. And yet when he paused in his prayer and looked for the solace and refuge of his friends, where were they? They were asleep. Surely David could relate to those feelings of isolation and loneliness. Perhaps you can too. And yet of note, when the friends failed both David and Jesus, God did not. And he won't fail you either. You can find refuge in him as David did. He describes his reaction, he describes his reality in verses 3 and 4. In verses 5 through 7, he details to us his reassurance. He says, I cried out to you, O Lord. I said, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Attend to my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are stronger than I. Bring my soul out of prison, that I may praise your name. The righteous shall surround me, for you shall deal bountifully with me. Again, thinking back on the fact that this psalm was written to make one wise, it could be wondered if David was writing this as a reminder and reassurance for himself. A man who faced and would face many troubles in his life, who would make many mistakes in his life. Loneliness, isolation, heartache are things that would assail him. And you have to wonder if this isn't just for the benefit of others, it's for his benefit too. This man whom the refuge of his friends and companions had failed, who felt as though no one around him acknowledged him or cared for his soul, still clung to one truth: that the God of heaven was his God. That he was his refuge, his shelter from the storm. The question of God's existence is not one that David struggles with. Even from the outset of the psalm, David is certain that God is there. David's certain that God's listening to him. And we see that contrasting repetition show up again. Remember how David emphasizes how he prays in verses 1 and 2? Here, we see that happen all over again. The first line of verse 5, David declares, I cried to the Lord. But in the second stanza, he collects himself and he says, I said. Even when he felt lost, even when he felt afraid, even when he felt overwhelmed, even when he wasn't sure of where his own path was going forward, when all of those things assailed him, he says, God knows where I'm going. Spurgeon notes that he cried first, but says afterwards that his cry was bitter, but his saying was sweet, that his cry was sharp and short, but his saying was fresh and full. In the process of getting all of those troubles off of his chest, David finds clarity. And it's for this reason that praying boldly, that praying without fear is so imperative for the faithful follower of God. As David builds towards this climax of this psalm, he begins to leave those troubles behind. And he focuses on the peace and the comfort of God. He is reminded and he expresses that God is his portion. He is reminded that in his lowest moments, it's God who has the power to deliver him. Where others had failed, God had not, and God would not. In David's description of God being his portion in the land of the living, Walton writes that in ancient thought, the earth was divided into two realms. The surface, where people lived, and the underworld, which was the abode of the dead. And he says that here the psalmist declares that God is the only real asset he had in life, and therefore was the only one that he could turn to for security. God would be the only refuge for him. And upon reaching the conclusion of this psalm, David declares that God would deal bountifully with him and that the righteous would surround him and he would find himself in a position to praise and glorify God. What a shift in his attitude. What a shift in his disposition. This is a psalm that begins with tears. It's a psalm that concludes with the praise and the glorification of God. It's a psalm that begins with a man who is lost and struggling to understand what's happening, and it finishes with a psalm as a psalm of someone who has found peace and comfort and safety and surety in the Lord. What a blessing that is. What a blessing that enables us who are faithful to him to weather the storms of life, to look at David and see how he did it and be able to take that model and apply it ourselves. Yet in thinking back to the scripture mentioned from 2 Corinthians and the young man and his mother who had come to worship and not found refuge, but instead found storms. We need to consider the blessing that we count in having God as our refuge and what it means for our lives. Too often, those who bear the name Christian find themselves in a position of allowing God to be the one who expresses love and mercy and compassion and comfort. And instead, we, his church, delight in pointing out sin and condemning those who find themselves lost in it. Don't take this as me saying Christians shouldn't expose sin and correct it. We should. But we're called also to imitate Christ. And when we think of Christ's ministry, one of the most pronounced aspects of it is his compassion that he felt for his fellow man. He took no joy in the sins of others. He took no joy in the struggles of others. It broke his heart to see those who were lost and wallowing in sin. Even his staunchest enemies aren't met with harsh words until his ministry is nearing its end. And even then, those words of woe to you are spoken in the hope that they open their eyes and bring a change in their lives. There was plenty of times in my 20s where I did not live a godly life, where I had fallen away. I bear the weight and the responsibility of those choices that I made when I turned away from the church, when I turned away from God. But I'll tell you what, I found myself on countless occasions wondering if anyone even noticed, wondering if anyone even cared. There were times when I felt like refuge had failed me, like nobody acknowledged me, like nobody cared for my soul. And I'm grateful that I lived long enough to meet Christians who cared not only about me sitting in a pew on Sunday mornings, but about me as a person and what the eternal destiny of my soul was. I'm thankful that I was afforded the time that I needed to make changes in my life. But I knew a 27-year-old man who was a faithful teenager of the church and fell away as an adult. And I'll never forget the call that I got in my second year standing back in that foyer where I had been told that man had been killed in a car accident and never had the chance to make things right. And I wonder if he felt like no one cared for his soul and that's why he didn't come back. I'm thankful that I was afforded the time to make changes in my life. In many ways, those changes were tough. In many ways, they were drastic, but they put me in the position of being able to take on this subject and help us to count one of the many great blessings that Christians have, that God is our refuge. But I'm here to tell you, God should not be our only refuge. He should not be the only one. Brother Phil said it wonderfully yesterday in his lecture. When you are at the lowest, the last place you should be is away from the church. The last place you should be is away from people who love you. For the lost and dying souls who remain in this world, God should not be their only refuge. In Him we find peace. In Him we find comfort. In Him, those of us who are here today have found hope. When the storms of life come our way, we know who to turn to. But those who are out there in that world, who don't know, those who have fallen away from God and have been drawn away by Satan, they don't have a shelter from those storms. They don't know where to look. They don't know who to seek. And we as Christians cannot leave that wholly in the hands of God. We cannot carry the attitude that if you are hurt by someone in the church and you leave, your faith was in men and not in God. We cannot pass the buck. We cannot point fingers and victim blame. We are called to be the light of the world. We are called to be those who reflect Jesus. God is our refuge. God is our comforter. But why does God comfort us? That we might be able to comfort others. Do you think God is really our refuge for us to just hoard that to ourselves? If God is our refuge, we should be His refuge for others. The church universal should be a refuge. The church locally should be a refuge. The individual Christians that embody the church should be a refuge for those around them. The school of preaching should be a refuge for those who don't know and want to learn. And if we are anything less, it is not good enough. We need to do better than to point fingers and say, it's your fault. Remember, God's our refuge, He is our shelter, but that is not a blessing that's meant to be kept to ourselves. I am blessed. You're blessed. God is our refuge, and because of that, there should never be another soul in this world who looks around and finds themselves saying, refuge has failed me. No one cares for me. You and I can be their refuge, and in doing so, we bring them to the ultimate source of peace. We bring them to the ultimate source of comfort. We bring them to the ultimate source of safety and security, that they too might enumerate their blessings and be able to declare, as David did, you, God, are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Thank you.